Hello, I'm Xavier Azalbert. I'm the head of a French media called France-Soir, which I run since 2016. So it was way before the current crisis that we are living or going through. It's an historic brand name of media. It was born in 1941 during the Second World War. It was at the time created by two resistants, and the name of the media at the time was Defense of France. It was only in 1944 that it took the brand name France-Soir. In France, it is and probably around the world, it is a media that has been looked and taught in journalist school for the way it conducted journalism through an individual called Pierre Lazareff. And Pierre Lazareff has a very famous words which say that the important for a media is to be read by his reader, and that's the most important thing. And we found our audience where we reach more than 5 million unique viewers, and 5 million for France, where you have 67 million people. It's a significant market share, and it puts you into, I would say, the top 10 online paper. It is what I call a participative and collaborative media. It basically means that I've combined civilians' expertise or citizens' expertise with journalism, trying to provide access to individuals who have a true professional expertise in one field and who have something to say that is meaningful and who do not have currently access to the mainstream media. That can be a university professor, or it can be a doctor who doesn't have his access to the mainstream media, all the way to a lawyer or to an individual that has a deep expertise about the oil industry or the gas industry. We really relied on what's called a collaborative approach. It's what I call a peer and third-party review. And in addition, these individuals don't have any conflict of interest. That means what they say is what they think, it's their beliefs. They substantiate their analysis with their own facts. They not only substantiate that with their own facts, but very often they have the ability more than anybody else to debate and to provide you with a different point of view. The objective of France-Soir is not to convince a reader of an opinion, it's to provide true journalism, true information, what I call loyal information. A loyal information is the best information you can deliver at point T in time, because we all know that information evolves. And so we have to deliver the best information in respect of the Munich Charter, which the article number 1 says that a journalist should give the truth, whatever it cost him, whatever is the cost to him. And so that's basically what we have tried to deliver whenever we thought an information was against the official narrative or against what we were getting from the press agencies or the AFP or the PR Newswire. If we think we didn't agree with the press release, then we would go against it. And we took what I call a contrarian approach.
What has happened with the media in the last 30 years, do you think?
Okay.
Have you seen the industry change or fundamentally change, or in what ways?
Okay. In the last 30 years, the media industry has changed significantly with the emergence of the social networks. There's been a concentration of the media in various countries. So there's very few international group of media. Whereas in the US or in France or in other countries, there's 5 or 6 or 10, up to 10 billionaires or very influential people who control the media. So there is what I would call, it's a very concentrated industry. In the last 10, 15 years, social media has given citizens the ability to create their own little channel through YouTube, through Facebook, and it gives you the impression that you can broadcast. However, The main placement power is still with the mainstream media and its concentration. So that's for the industry. And however, we've not seen a lot of cross-border. So you don't have a US company that has participation in other countries. However, you have what's called the press agencies, the AFP, the PR Newswire. There's 3 or 4, and you could have Reuters and Bloomberg and so on and so forth. These have global reach. They've had global reach from, and they control, with those 4 or 5 organizations control the message, okay?
Yeah, so how much of the mainstream media, like when you read New York Times, Washington Post, or Dallas Times, or French regional paper, are they taking all the articles from the big newswires? At
least 50% of your local newspaper information is sourced from those press and newswire agencies. The consequence is you have an harmonization of those messages. So it means that if there is an information about a particular drug that comes from the AFP, for example, let's take remdesivir. In 2020, remdesivir was going to be included in all the tests. That hit simultaneously in all the countries, I would say most of the OECD countries. It hits the mainstream media. And within 24 hours, you had the same message. It's going to be included. Same thing with the Lancet. The Lancet is this hydroxychloroquine end of story. In 24 hours, it hit all of those media because it was one information that came from those news agencies. The question is, what is the role of a true journalist? It's to take this information. The first thing you should do is verify this information. And the way they verify this information is, in my view, questionable. Because one of the first things is you have a bias of, conformism. So the first thing they do is they say, well, it comes from AFP or it comes from PR Newswire. So basically they've done the fact checking or they have done the relevant fact checking. So I'm going to accept this. Then they look at the competitor. Oh, well, they're airing this story. We've got to find a different angle. So they're not questioning whether the foundation of this story is right. They're just trying to look at a different angle. And this is where another bias comes in, because if the information originally is wrong, then they're not really at questioning the origin of the information. They're really just adding another level. They're creating what I call a derivative product from the information. This is really important because in 2008, you had a subprime crisis, so they're creating sub-information. They're not creating appropriate information. So we are overly informed with sub-quality information. And that, for me, is really one of the major issues. And we know that the minute you're giving a derived information from a wrong information, you're accentuating the error and the perception. Now, the minute the shot is given, or you have proliferation of the message. So if you see 7 times the same information and it's right, it's fine. But if you see 7 times the same information and it's wrong, basically you end up by having a wrong information. So hydroxychloroquine, end of story. It takes 24 hours for the world over to think it's finished. And then you have a few guys who just say, well, oh, hold on a second, there is an issue with this. It's not entirely correct. And it takes 2 weeks before the story changed. The momentum goes from we bought the PR Newswire or the AFP story all the way to we're going to sell this story. We're not going to like this story anymore. So they just really changed their mind. And then they have to justify, the mainstream media have to justify why they changed their mind. Rather than saying they actually got it wrong in the first place, which nobody likes to do, they say, well, there's some new information or there is a revised story. So they are doing a revisionist approach to the history. Now, this is what we didn't do at France-Soir, because we basically said right from the start, there's an issue with this story. And then why is there an issue? Because I read the study, I found there was some issue, and in order to complete my information, to add to that, what I did is I interviewed Mandeep Mehra. Mandeep Mehra was the main doctor who signed this study. I'm one of the rare person around this planet to have actually spoken to this individual. We just ask the questions, the difficult questions, and then that's why we're taking a contrarian approach. That's why we're not buying. So we're just doing our job. We're just doing the analyst job, the journalist part, the analyst part of the journalist work, which is an analyst. And we're just analyzing this information that's being given, as opposed to just buying the story. So,
and can you just list the big newswires, the 3 newswires?
AFP, PR Newswire, and Associated Press.
Okay, great. And then, so do you see that strategy? You touched on it briefly, that there's just repeat things.
So let's talk about the market for information and the industry of information. You have basically the message, you have the messenger, you have the broadcaster, and then you have the integrator of information. You have the AFP, PR Newswire, Associated Press. They are the integration that will deliver most of the news, and then the most of the message. Now, how do those messages get into AFP or into those? Well, you have a number of journalists who are sourcing those information from individuals who are on the field, and then you have organizations who are delivering PR press releases, and they will push those press releases because that's a way for them to do advertising. That's a way for them to communicate. So if you have Pfizer, for example, and they are going to deliver a press release on, we are at stage 1 or stage 2 of our research on the vaccine, what does it do? Well, it is a market announcement. Now, Pfizer is a listed organization. They have some duty to deliver information, to release this information in a simultaneous manner because they're a listed organization. However, these are press releases. A normal process would be a journalist would read this press release, analyze the pros and cons, and provide a analysis that should be independent of the lab. So what happens is the journalist gets this PR, this press release from a lab or from GAFAM organization, looks at it and says, well, I'm under pressure, I don't really have time, I know this guy, usually their information is thorough enough, and the press release are written so that it looks like an article. And very often, the content of a press release goes into a PR newswire almost as identical to the press release initially. It's a combination of laziness or lack of time to actually do that, or proliferation of information. So because it comes from XYZ, now on top, there could be some commercial agreements between a lab and a broadcaster because they will buy advertising spaces. So, I'm going to buy advertising space, or if you are going to air this story. So there is a trade.
Mm-hmm. They're brought to you by Pfizer?
There is a trade. It's brought to you by Pfizer, brought to you by Apple, brought to you by Microsoft, and the independence of a journalist, the autonomy of a journalist is basically lost in there. And you have several conflicts that arise, several biases in the information. So the information that we end up by obtaining is biased. And the true job of a journalist is to inform the citizen, is not to be on the side of the party who emitted the message. It's to be on the side of the person who is going to receive the message. And that's really the two sides. In order to be trusted, a journalist should be trusted by the person who reads it, not the person who sends the message. And what happens, the forces in presence, is that journalists are tied to networks, they're tied to broadcasters, they're tied to government agencies, they're tied to networks of individuals, and they are less tied to their duties towards the citizen. And that what has happened in the last few years. We've seen a change of forces. The forces in presence is that the journalists tend to be tied to There's been proliferation of sort of fact-checking agencies who are really owned by those networks. So so it is a justification for the job that the journalists are not doing anymore. So journalists being tied, so it's like an internal audit. So first of all is you have your own fact-checking agencies because we're going to fact-check what colleagues are saying. This is a competition. This is a something that is driven by, I want to fact-check what my competitors are doing, because if I can hit on them, it's easier to hit on my competitor than to really look at what I'm doing. And so the market for information has been totally biased. Its behavior has been affected by the fact that the change of power is derived from, in the last 30 years, you've had a change of power. And we've seen shareholders of those organizations take a much more prominent role than the role that's being given to journalism. We've also seen government agency take a more prominent role, especially in France. France is probably one of the countries where you have the most subsidy in the EU countries
of media,
in the media industry. It is, you could almost say, because in the last few years it's more than 2 billion euros that were provided to media, and whenever there is a hiccup in the media industry, then the government steps in. So
what does that do to the media quality? I mean, it's like...
Well, it's not to the media quality, it's to the message quality. because the media survive because of the state subsidy, but they will never hit on the hand that's feeding them. So it's, if you need an extra 500 million, well, let's group together. We go and ask the government, because suddenly paper prices hikes up. And this is what happens. The paper prices, because of the current crisis, goes up. Well, the government steps in and provides an assistance. Now, there is inherently a problem in the media industry. That is, this industry has not been run to hit profit. Profit, I'm not talking about delivering shareholder value. I'm talking about delivering sufficient amount of cash in order to reinvest into your own organization and to become independent and autonomous from those. Now, because it's structurally in loss situation, it is dependent on the state. And what we've tried to do with our media is to have a media that is completely autonomous and independent from the states. We've never received any grants. We've never received any subsidies. And we do not want to have those subsidies, because any assistance we get from the states makes you dependent. And if you want to actually deliver true information, and true information to your readers, loyal information to your readers, you should be totally independent. On top of this, these media are owned by multi-billionaires. These guys don't need money. So they really have these organizations as PR agencies, or they're using it for influence because they have a placing power. They have no incentive of turning those companies into a profit-making organization.
Why would someone like Jeff Bezos buy a failing business like the Washington Post?
Well, Jeff Bezos would have some incentive to actually buy the Washington Post for a number of reasons. Reason number one is the Washington Post is a very famous brand, okay? And as a brand, it means media. In France, for example, we have a billionaire called Xavier Azalbert. He says, well, whenever there is a media that says something's bad about me, I'm just buying him out. So, there is a reason sometimes to actually take someone out of the market. You take one of your competitor, you avoid having problems. So it is a problem-solving strategy sometimes. But in the case of Jeff Bezos, if you have 90% market share everywhere around the globe, you're going to look at another vertical, or you're going to look forward integration, backwards integration, or you're going to look at the way it will help you most in your core business. And so
propaganda in this case.
It is a way for him to purchase communication. It is a way for him to purchase influence, to continue his lobbying efforts to actually open more and more and more Amazon center around the world. Now, I'm not hitting on Jeff Bezos and his strategy with the Washington Post.
But they're all like that, right?
But that's, here, if we take one example, so they're they're conducting what I would call a lobbying and marketing work through their ownership of media.
And is that contradictory to this idea of a free press?
It is contradictory. It's not contradictory to a free market if you use those media in an appropriate manner. So if you just, on the face of it, say to journalists, you can say whatever you want, and you're really truly independent. That's why you have all the journalist associations. That's why you have journalists who are really against the shareholders. But eventually, when the journalists want to do journalism and they really have to pay their bill at the end of the month, sometimes the Article number 1 of the Munich Charter goes out of the window, which basically means you have to deliver the truth, whatever it costs you. You're going to make a compromise. And so a lot of journalists have made a compromise with themselves, with their own sort of mental model, and they are destroying the trust with the readers because of this compromission they're making. It's exactly like if you don't trust justice anymore, because you don't get loyal information. If you don't get loyal justice anymore, if you don't get impartial justice, here you're not getting impartial information. And that is the start of biased information. It's the start of, at the start of biased information, you have insider trading, you have manipulation of information, you have manipulation of share price on the stock market. And these are governed by various regulations or various legislations. And all the way, when it falls into the hand of governments, then you have propaganda. In order to understand the situation, sometimes it's good to actually step out of an industry and to look at the airline industry. We all know that the airline industry is something which is very desirable. Why? Because people like traveling. So people like information and people like traveling. We all know, like in France, for example, we have a huge airline controlled by the state in history called Air France. Or you have British Airways, or you have US Airways. Now, all of these businesses have been structurally failing for a number of years. Structurally failing means they go from being recapitalized to a loss, and they are being recapitalized, and it's an eternal ending story. And one day you have a competitor that steps in and say, we're going to do low cost, like Ryanair or EasyJet in Europe, like you have a Blue Jet in the US. And so the way they start is they start by thinking, what do we need to do to make this business profitable? That means viable in the long run. And they remodel this industry. And we've seen the traditional airline carriers being really hit by the low-cost carriers. And the low-cost carriers are putting pressure on the traditional carriers in order to restructure themselves and to change themselves. So they will either change themselves or they will end up by dying. What happens with the traditional media, like the Washington Post, the New York Times? These are institutions. They missed, let's say, the different waves of the net 1.0, the internet 2.0, and the internet 3.0. So they sometimes miss transformation. The traditional media, they really ended up by having problems because they failed to adapt themselves to evolving market conditions. Now, at that point in time, they become really cheap to buy because they're in Chapter 11, they're going under, so they cost one symbolic dollar, and you just have to refinance the losses in order to keep that. And so accessing to those media, the barriers to entry are really low. And you can buy a brand like the Washington Post. It wasn't really a very expensive buy. Same thing for the New York Times. These are not expensive assets to buy. If you want to buy Google today, it's going to cost you a lot more, or Apple. But these brand names who are historic brand names, because you're buying 300 years or 200 years legacy and history of media, so you're buying yourself a share of the history. And it starts with this, and they look at it and just say, okay, well, I'm going to end up by having a lobbying agency in Washington, D.C. Why? Because they want to continue to grow their business. They want to continue to develop their business. And we all know that in D.C. Or in Brussels, if you have a paper and you're going to have to conduct some lobbying work because you want to avoid antitrust law, antitrust legislation. It's easier to own a media because you're going to end up by having a placing power for messages for politicians, and it's a game that is being played. It's really a complicated game of influence, and the victim of that game is the consumer.
So how much of the news is, do you think, just press releases?
I would say in excess of 50% right now.
And so how does that process work? Like, let's say some company writes a press release.
A company would probably use a PR agency, okay? They would start by writing a press release in-house. Then they would subcontract that to a PR agency. Because that's step one for the information to get outside of the organization. Sometimes they've internalized the PR department inside this organization, but it's sometimes very good to have an independent person who's going to do this for you. Because you could just say, well, it's my PR agency. So you have a fuse. If suddenly the backfires on you, you can always fire the PR company. You can always blame it on that. Now, on top of this, there's a lot of individuals who are playing the game of revolving doors. They used to be in power, so they either become lawyers, and in France, you can easily become a lawyer if you've been in power, or they become on the PR side, the lobbying side, and they're going to sell their address book to those companies and say, well, I know this person, I'm going to actually help you conduct this interview, or I'm going to help you obtain a particular favor. Now, it's bending the rules without sort of crossing the red line, okay? So you're just using the power of influence and the placing power. So that step one is the PR. It gets into the press newswire information feed, and those press newswire, especially AFP in France, AFP and Associated Press, they will get thousands and thousands and thousands of information per hour. Some of them they have to process, some of them they have the ability to process, others they don't. Now, there is going to be some information that will naturally trickle from the PR agency all the way to the market with very little verification. Or should I say, verification on the information that does not match their own views. And that's where it starts to have the propaganda effect. And there's a lot of information that do not actually get to the market. And eventually, I can give an example of what happened yesterday. Yesterday, I got an information that the head of AFP was put under examination in a case of defamation in France. I published this in my newspaper, online. So Fabrice Fries is the head, CEO, chairman, director of publication of AFP. This guy knows he's put under examination because he knows that before everybody else. It is important. It's an important information. You're the guarantor of information. There's a number of board members of AFP who wrote to the culture minister a few years ago saying, we are guardian of very prized asset or something which is really important, which is information. Meaning, if there is a bias, then we will lose the credibility.
Okay, so this guy was put under examination.
He was put under examination. Do you think that AFP covered the story? No.
No.
Do you think that the mainstream media covered the story? No. So we aired this story. Do you think that fact checkers came after us? No. So what did I do? I wrote personally to AFP Fact Check. AFP Fact Check is the fact checker of AFP. I wrote and say, could you please air this story and verify the story? Because you're not airing the story. They haven't responded. So 24 hours on, and information that the CEO of an organization that runs information is not in the market. Why? This is absolutely insane. Now, because you have double standards, let's talk about the ex-Prime Minister of France, Edouard Philippe. He was put under examination for different motives. Today, has it been aired? Of course it's been aired. Every media talks about it. Now, last few weeks ago, it's the Minister of Justice in France who was put under examination. Everybody covers it. So in fact, it's interesting because we all criticize governments, members of governments, but whenever they are put under examination by justice, the information hit the market. And they have to explain themselves in front of the public. But when a guy like Fabrice Fils, as the head of the organization, it's not covered. And that's what I consider a serious issue, because it's serious misconduct for me.
How much time does a journalist have to write a story?
Probably in the 70s, a journalist would have a lot more time to write an article. An article will lay on the desk of a journalist for a number of hours. Because he was going to think about that, he's going to discuss it with his colleagues, and now he's being put under pressure for productivity. So the issue is productivity has killed quality of information, in my view. However, it's not the only issue. I think there's a lack of independence of the journalist, and that is probably a more important problem, because we are a small media, so we have the same issue as everybody else. We want to air as many stories, and we have made less mistakes. And it's not the fact that we have more time or less time. It's the fact that we are simply independent. And so I believe that the bias that you have in information is not entirely due to the fact that you have more or less time to conduct the analysis.
But wouldn't it be good? They can't call the sources and verify anything in 2 hours, right? I mean,
but before in the 70s, you didn't have the telephone everywhere. You have telex, you had fax. It took time to actually send. Now you have WhatsApp, you have Signal. Everybody's got a cell phone, so you can be in contact with everyone. And for me today, it's so easy to call Mandeep Mehra on the 24th of May 2020 to ask him, a few questions about the study before airing the story. It would have taken any journalist a few minutes to do that, to obtain his phone number. This is what it took me.
Yeah.
So everybody, if in my position I can do it, everybody. Oh, there is some barriers. There's a barrier of the language, okay, but they can find a journalist that speaks English. Second thing, there's a barrier to actually read the story. Well, they can find somebody who's read the story. Then there's the barrier to actually ask the right questions. And I asked some very simple questions to Mandeep Mehra. One of the questions I asked him is, did you see the data? Mm-hmm. And he told me no. Did you see the patients? And he told me no. But you know what? The statistical method we used is a very advanced method, and it can help us to actually map out the equivalent. It's the best method to map out a randomized control trial. And I just asked him, do you know that on the other side of the road, there are a number of professors, because he's at Harvard Medical School, and on the other side, the Harvard Business School, or at least in the vicinity, you have two professors who just say that they should not use this technique because it creates bias. And I said, no. So I'd just like to say, well, the first three questions, he hasn't seen the data, he hasn't seen patients, he's a cardiologist, and he's just signing a piece of paper. Who's CEO of an organization is going to tell you, I've not seen this, and he still signed the investments? He will get fired for that. He will get questioned. Its integrity is challenged. So here, any journalist, if they wanted, they had the capacity. It's that either they were under influence not to do that, so under pressure, we've got to air the story, or the journal on the other side has done this, It's okay, we're going to do it. So they're going to create a mistake, we're going to actually complete the same mistake. And so we've seen a lot of this in the information. People are doing what their friends are doing, conformism. They have less time to actually conduct the analysis, but at the same time, they are sometimes turning a blind eye on a number of things. So they are really making a compromise with truth.
And what do you think is what role do you think things like Project Mockingbird or the involvement with the intelligence agencies of media, do you think that's a role in their bias? Or?
Of course, intelligence agencies around the globe, whether it's American, French, British, Israeli, Chinese, intelligence agencies have a serious role to play. Now, in the US, there is a fact-checking company called NewsGuard. You have the two members at SED claim to actually be ex-CIA individuals. And what they do is they actually deliver a notation of the quality of your paper. So it's like a notation of the integrity of a paper. And in June 2020, they basically downgraded our paper and just said, well, I asked for a video with them. I had a video conference and they just told us, well, you can't say this, you can't say that, you can't say that, you can't say that. I said, why? Why can't I say that? Well, because it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. I said, okay, it's wrong, but tell me why it's wrong. So they're talking about lockdowns, and we just challenged the aberration of lockdown from a human, from a social point of view, from an economic point of view in June 2020. And they tell us, no, it's wrong because nature is saying that it's wrong. The origin of the virus, well, you can't say that it's not natural because the CIA says it's the natural trend or the momentum of information toward this is the hypothesis. We all know today that the fact that the virus may have come from a lab or has come from a lab is not a conspiracy anymore. Intelligence agencies, through fact checks or through the discussion they have with social networks, such as Mark Zuckerberg said very clearly that he had some contact with a US agency, I think it's the FBI, who, during the election, not to talk about the content of Hunter Biden's laptop. He basically went on record for this. So obviously, because of the placing power of this organization, because of the influence they have, then it's natural that they have contact with these agencies. It's just a question of how they're being used, how they're being instrumentalized. We know that Facebook has been really instrumentalized and even accepted to actually pay a fine when it has the Cambridge Analytics issue, where they found out they had some surveys issues. So they are playing a significant role from a global point of view in influencing people. Now, we all know that government agencies, whether CIA or any sort of intelligence agencies, they will look very closely what these guys are doing. Because as a starting point, these media or these social media are being used for sometimes to threaten our democracy, like terrorism. Now, if the close contacts that exist between a Facebook, a Google, and the CIA and the FBI and all of the government agencies is to really prevent terrorism, I'm sure that every citizen will not have any issue with this because they will say it's the right use. It's not an abuse. The minute they are being used to abuse individuals, then that's when you're stepping the line. And this is what happened with when you have this monopoly, where you have this company that have global reach. That's why in the US you have this antitrust legislation, and in 1994 all the way to 1997, it worked really well because they tried to break down Microsoft because Microsoft had embarked Internet Explorer, and they said, no, we don't want to have that. What happened? 5 years later, we have Google. So we prevented from having Microsoft placing power with and combining sort of on its PC the Internet Explorer, and suddenly you have Google. So we've let this situation happen, and antitrust legislation always are 5 years behind or 6 years behind because the best brain goes into the private industry. And so it's natural that the government agencies will look at that because they will obtain information. Once again, if they are actually use this information in order to conduct and to really prevent our democracy from being affected, then there's no issue. The minute it steps the line, it's abuse. And I think we've gone into an abusive situation.
And does there appear to be some coordination globally of certain messaging? Like I just noticed under COVID, it was this first time I really saw, leaders of every country in the world say the same phrases.
Conformism. Conformism of the message, conformism of the general policies, that is a question that we've had because
since COVID.
Since COVID, yeah. But it's not only since COVID, because you could just argue that when you have Colin Powell that goes to United Nations with a little vial of anthrax in order to obtain, I would say the support from the various countries to invade Iraq, then at the same time you had proliferation of the same information. Now in France, we have Dominique de Villepin, who was actually at the time minister, who just went against that. He did not buy the story. And it was a geopolitical move, and it was really one of the last time when we've seen one of the French minister opposed to an American sort of strategy. Tony Blair embarked on that and embarked everybody into what we all know was a fake. It's easier to conform to what your neighbor is doing. It means your neighbor buys a red car, I'm going to buy a red car. Your neighbor does a lockdown, I'm looking around, everybody is doing the same thing. So sometimes we are thinking that there is this global, I would say, conspiracy, but sometimes it's easy to actually look at what people are doing in the street next door. They all behave the same. This is what I call by conformism. The elites conform. They are wearing the same suits, they're buying the same shirts, they are buying the same ties, they are, look at lawyers, they all look alike. So the conformism is really an issue. We've created conformism through education. By having the Ivy Leagues, by having the Oxford, Cambridge, by having the grandes écoles in France, who are delivering individuals who are all alike, we are not creating people who are criticizing themselves. They are in a closed shell, they're criticizing others, protecting themselves. And this is a serious issue. Now, if you look at the best employers around the globe, or those organizations who have been called the best employers, what do they look for in recruitment? Do they look for the same people? Well, if they only got the same people, they will eventually die. So if you take investment banks or management consultancy, they are looking for people who have a sufficient amount of conformism, but also can think by themselves. Now, investment banking, they're going to want people who are not trend followers. They want people who are thought leaders. The conformism kills, in essence, creativity. And what we have seen is probably the emergence of a mediocre response. During the COVID crisis, we've seen a lot of politicians deliver exactly the same message. And we've seen reels on television where they were saying, let's get vaccinated, or the vaccine is the only solution. And so these messages look like propaganda because they're delivered at the same time by the same people, or by different people in different countries, but it's the same message. And what happens is, of course, it's the placing power of information, the rapidity of information, and those individuals who are, in essence, conforming to the narrative that's being pushed by the press releases without sort of thinking twice. And in my view, there are some countries around the world who didn't do this. Now, if you look at India, for example, they didn't actually push the same message. It's a big country, 1.4 billion. And in India, for example, they didn't push the vaccine the way they actually pushed it in other countries. The health minister even pushed ivermectin and early treatments on the official list for a number of months. In Brazil, you have federal states. You have some states where, like for example, the state of Pará, which is next to Amazonia, the state health minister of Pará, he made it compulsory for individuals who have early treatments, like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. Next state, Amazonia, they didn't. 5 times more deaths in one state than the other. Now, do we take a lesson from that?
And so where do you think the media industry is going? Or what's the future of media now?
Okay, the future of media is, first of all, media should be totally independent and autonomous. It should be the force power. Now, in my view, we're going to see the emergence of true independent media with business models that end up by having a true independent that correspond to the demand for information. And I believe that we're going to see the decrease of power of social media. And this decrease of power could come from 2 sources. One of them is the mass. Mass people turns away from those because they're fed up. The second thing is regulators end up by saying, you have monopolistic situation, you have cartelistic situation, antitrust legislation, it prevents competition. What it is, it's creating biased information, and we want to have truly independent information. Exactly like we've seen Microsoft in 1994-97 being threatened of being broken down. There's going to be a push by politicians to have breakdowns of some of this GAFAM influence. Now it is...
What is GAFAM?
GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon. And it's basically those companies that have global reach. They go beyond frontiers. They're more powerful than some world economies. If you look at the consumption of information and the way information is being consumed, the reach and the readership of the traditional mainstream media has dropped significantly, and it will continue dropping. Exactly like the traditional airlines have lost some of their customers because they could not change their business model rapidly enough, or they could not adapt. And so I think that the mainstream media are going to be distrusted, and they're going to, the consumer will turn themselves away to alternative media who are smaller, who are delivering a different form of information, who are delivering information as opposed to modified information or to subprime or sub-information. But there's also the possibility that regulators see the influence, and at one point or another, regulators are acting on behalf of, they're protecting the individuals, they're protecting citizens, and they could suddenly wake up in some countries. Like, for example, if there is a change of governments in the US, or the chamber or Senate goes back to the Republican, there could be a change and a push towards more independence and towards an antitrust legislation of those media.
But don't you think that could have a dark side of like creating this problem like in Europe where the government's involved with the press? Like it could set a precedent of state intervention in the press?
Well, first of all, as I don't dislike state intervention in some industries at some point in time. What I think is abnormal and should be prescribed by law is the fact that this intervention is permanent. because a permanent intervention is not subsidy, it is a government incentive on a permanent basis. So if there is an industry that needs to be subsidized or state helped for some time, that's a right decision by the state. If it is constant, then that's when it starts to become an issue.
A year ago, there was a big push for, should Facebook be regulated, right?
Well, there is an issue about what is the status of the social media, what's their responsibility. Today, they are not regulated, so they are self-regulated. Remember, investment banks in the subprime crisis, they said, we do not want to be regulated. We are capable of self-regulating ourselves. We all know what happened. And every time you want to actually put regulation on the information, everybody is shouting, freedom of expression, freedom of expression. The problem is not about regulation, it's what type of regulation. Now, for example, if you have a journalist that delivers constantly a message that is of a propaganda nature, he should lose his capability instantly of being a journalist because he should not be trusted. So here the issue is, if you make a mistake once, you have to learn from your mistake. If you continue making the same mistake time and time again, it basically means you're not doing journalism, you're doing propaganda. And therefore you need to have a degree of ethics, you need to have a degree of compliance with a number of ethical rules. And I do believe that independent media will end up by having more ethics than the mainstream media, because they're further from the external influence, they're closer from the people, they have a true understanding of what individual citizen wants as information, and they all know that citizens want loyal information.
But what do you think is the media environment now? We have the mainstream that's got a lot of propaganda in it, and then how would you characterize the alternative media?
Well, I don't like talking about the alternative media as being alternative. In fact, you have mainstream media who are dominant media. And these are like dinosaurs. And we all know that dinosaurs died at one point, and suddenly paved the way from other species. So what we're saying is we're seeing other species of media who are coming to fruition. And the other species of media are of a different nature. So they're not dominant. So if you're not dominant, you have to be more agile. You have to be closer to your market, because when you're a dinosaur, we all know that the dinosaurs are very far from their readers. They're not, so they have a lot of market share, they have a lot of placing power for advertising, and that's their strengths. Their weak point is the loyalty of customers. And if customer goes away, then suddenly they lose their placing power for advertising, they lose all of their market share, and and that has happened in the industry. So I think that those new media, they are not alternative. They are representing the future of information. They are they are representing what the citizen really want as information. Now, and they probably have got more ethics than all of the mainstream media. The position they're taking is what I call a contrarian position. So you have the mainstream media who are trend followers, because they are, as we've said, normative, conformative, they conform themselves to the norm. So they are trend followers. And the thought leaders are in those new media, those what you call alternative media, or in essence are, for me, the mainstream media, because they're delivering loyal information. It's we're seeing a war, an information war, and we're seeing a serious crisis in the information market. And this market needs to transform itself. It needs to have a combination of self-regulation and a combination of regulation, because information is probably the most lethal weapon. It's probably more lethal than nuclear. It's lethal because what it does is, as Jim Morrison say, And those who control the media control your brain. And what happens is if you control the brain of people, you can really frighten them. You can drive them left, or you can drive them right. This is the Hamlin Piper.
So the solution is real journalism, then, huh? What do you think is
in my view, you need to have a level of ethics in journalism and a level of independence that is way beyond what you have right now. And creating the conditions for that is not easy. But it is feasible. We've seen industry where we have created the conditions for risk which is as close to zero as possible. Let me give you two examples. Civil nuclear industry. We are all frightened of a nuclear plant sort of blowing up because we all know the consequences. We've watched in Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island in the US, and some other Fukushima and so on and so forth. So we've seen industries like this who have managed to obtain quasi-zero risk. We've seen the airline industry who we've seen one of the safest way of traveling. Now, these two industries have managed to self-regulate themselves in order to provide you with a trusted environment. Why would the media not be capable of achieving the same goal? The question is integrity, having the right people, fostering the right environment. And this is why I'm very optimistic that we will get there. And if you have the zero risk in nuclear industry, we should be able to have zero risk in the media industry for appropriate information.
Are we experiencing like information overload, and what psychological state does that?
Yes, we are seeing information overload in the market. In marketing, okay, there is a consumer theory that says if you see 3 times, 4 times, 6 times, 7 times the same message, you will end up by believing the message, and you will end up by buying the message because of the repetition. Now, the interesting element is marketing relies on 2 things. First of all is you're being informed that there is a new product, and the second thing is you buying this product. So you could have an intention of buying a product and eventually you never buy it. And we all know the moment of truth is the moment when you purchase the product. It's not when you actually declare you have an intention of buying the product. And we all know that intention to purchase a product is always higher than the reality. And therefore, in the market for information, if you see 7 times the same message, it does not mean that you will get the right information. It does not mean that you will buy the information. One way or another, one day you will get a different information on the same topic, and you will question this. So what we have to foster is not an environment where we reduce the number of times of information overload, but an environment where you have debate over information. Because what we do not have is the debate. In every single market, you have competition. The competition for information should be fostered, and that's one of the issues of regulators. And regulators should encourage alternative media and discourage dominant media from creating unlawful competition, from killing their competitors. Because what it is when you kill your competitor, you're in the information market, you're killing debate. We know we're living some troubled times with respect to information, because we've seen a lot of propaganda, and we're living through some troubled times. And in those troubled times, and if you look at the transformation of many industries, and we've lived through some troubled times before, First World War, Second World War, and before that, we've seen some seriously troubled times. And out of troubled times, usually there are some new companies, new way of doing business, new way of thinking that emerge. And I'm really hopeful that we will see through this crisis, because the mass, at one point, they will go away. They will turn their eye away from those individuals who are using influence wrongly towards their advantage as opposed to the advantage of the mass. It will take probably a few years before there's a transformation, but I'm really hopeful. And that's what I'm working towards. I'm working towards making sure that information is not used as a weapon, that is used really to educate individuals, to make them stronger, to communicate with each other. Whereas today, information in the last 2 years has been used as a serious weapon to influence individuals in the wrong direction. Probably our enemy is globalism. Our enemy is the fact that we have lost track of what is truly in our interest because we've been lazy. We've relied on civil servants for too long. We've relied on the states for too long. So maybe we will have to lose quality of life. We will have to lose a number of things, and we have to let go a number of things in order to restore freedom of information and our general freedoms. And I think it will happen.